The weight of words. The word hung in the air like an unwelcome specter. Monkey. A tense silence fell over the bustling city street, broken only by the faint hum of passing traffic. All eyes turned toward the officer who had uttered it, Brad Halstead. His stance oozed arrogance, leaning against his patrol car with his arms crossed, his smirk dripping with mockery. Opposite him stood a man of quiet composure. His tailored suit, polished shoes, and upright posture spoke of confidence and self-respect, but his piercing gaze revealed something deeper, an unwavering strength. The insult might have wounded others, but it struck him like rain on a shield. "Did you just call me a monkey?" the man asked, his voice calm but laced with a razor's edge. "I did," Brad sneered, his hand grazing the holster on his hip as if flaunting his authority. "What are you gonna do about it?" The man didn't flinch. He simply let the silence stretch, his stillness amplifying the weight of the moment. The crowd that had gathered seemed to hold its collective breath, the tension pressing down like a storm cloud. Finally, the man took a single step forward. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" His voice carried a quiet intensity that made Brad's smirk falter. "Should I?" Brad barked, feigning bravado. "What are you, some lawyer? Think your fancy suit is gonna scare me?" The man tilted his head slightly, an almost imperceptible smile curling the corner of his lips. But before he could respond, a younger officer, his face pale and drawn, approached hastily. "Brad," the rookie said, his voice tight with unease. "Maybe you should." "Quiet, rookie," Brad snapped, cutting him off. "I got this." Turning back to the man, Brad waved dismissively. "Say whatever you've got to say and get out of my face." The man took another measured step forward, his eyes unyielding. "Let's just say you'll be seeing me again. Very soon." His word hung in the air like a thunderclap, and with that, he turned and walked away, his composed demeanor leaving a ripple of awe and curiosity in his wake. Earlier that morning had marked a new beginning for Chief Daniel Carter. At 42, he had risen through the ranks not by luck or privilege, but by sheer determination and an unshakable sense of purpose. A man of integrity and keen intellect, Daniel was no stranger to the hurdles imposed by prejudice, yet he had never allowed them to define him. The police station buzzed with nervous energy as he arrived for his first day. Whispers trailed him as he walked through the halls in his crisp uniform, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Some officers greeted him with respect, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Daniel noticed it all but maintained his steady stride, stopping to introduce himself to everyone he met. Brad Halstead wasn't there that morning. Out on patrol, he was oblivious to the changes happening back at the station, and to the man who now occupied the chief's office. By midday, Daniel decided to step out for a walk, a ritual he had carried with him throughout his career. He enjoyed feeling the pulse of the neighborhoods he served, the direct connection to the communities he vowed to protect. It was on that walk that he saw Brad for the first time. The officer was leaning aggressively over the window of a car, his voice sharp and accusatory. Inside, a young woman, clearly shaken, clutched the steering wheel with trembling hands. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He approached calmly, intending to de-escalate. "Is there a problem here?" he asked evenly. Brad barely glanced at him. "Move along. Police business." "I'm aware," Daniel said, his tone unwavering. "I asked if there's a problem." Brad straightened, finally turning to size up the man addressing him. The tailored suit threw him off. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel didn't answer the question. Instead, he addressed the young woman. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Before she could respond, Brad stepped between them. "I told you to move along," he said, his voice rising. "You interfering with an officer." Daniel's calm remained unshaken. "I'm simply observing." Brad scoffed. "Observing, huh? You one of those social justice types, here to play hero." And then, with a venomous sneer, Brad crossed the line. "Oh, I see what this is. Another monkey sticking his nose where it doesn't belong." The words stopped the world. A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Even Brad seemed momentarily struck by the weight of his own insult. But instead of backtracking, he doubled down, his bravado a desperate mask for the unease creeping into his gut. Daniel didn't react immediately. He studied Brad with an unreadable expression, letting the silence stretch until it felt suffocating. Then, with deliberate calm, he pulled out his phone and began typing. "What are you doing?" Brad demanded, his voice defensive. Daniel didn't reply. He finished typing, put his phone away, and fixed Brad with a faint smile. "Like I said," he repeated, "you'll be seeing me again." A shift in the air. The atmosphere at the station changed the moment Daniel walked back through its doors. This time, he wore his full uniform. His badge, polished and gleaming, caught the fluorescent light with an almost symbolic brilliance. Officers paused mid-conversation as he passed, some straightening their postures, others quickly pretending to be busy. Brad, oblivious to the growing tension, swaggered into the station a few minutes later. He was in the middle of recounting his earlier encounter, embellishing the details for an amused audience. "Some big shot in a suit thought he could intimidate me," Brad said with a grin. "Tried to tell me how to do my job. Can you believe that?" His laughter died the moment Daniel stepped into the room. The chief's presence was magnetic, his calm authority a stark contrast to Brad's brashness. As Daniel approached, the crowd around Brad fell silent, parting like the Red Sea. "Officer Halstead," Daniel said evenly. Brad turned, his grin faltering as he recognized the man in front of him. His confusion morphed into disbelief as he processed the uniform, the badge, the command in Daniel's voice. "Wait," Brad stammered. "You're the new chief." Daniel didn't need to answer. The truth was written in every polished detail of his uniform, every inch of his composed demeanor. Brad's face drained of color as he realized the gravity of his mistake. "Yes," Daniel said finally, his tone as steady as ever. "And we need to talk." A lesson learned. What followed was a lesson in accountability. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried the weight of justice, fairness, and the years of resilience that had brought him to this moment. Brad's bravado crumbled under the quiet strength of a man who had faced far greater adversaries and emerged unbroken. And in that moment, the entire station learned something about leadership. True authority isn't wielded through intimidation, but through integrity. As for Brad, his journey wasn't over. The road ahead would demand reflection, humility, and change. A challenge Daniel believed everyone deserved the chance to face. And so, a new chapter began, not just for the station, but for everyone who witnessed the power of courage, grace, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. This story teaches us that leadership isn't about power, it's about principle. And no matter how dark the storm, integrity will always shine through. The weight of responsibility. The atmosphere in the station was still charged as Chief Daniel Carter led Officer Brad Halstead into his office. Every officer who had witnessed the scene stood frozen, trading uneasy glances. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone. The new chief wasn't just here to wear a title. He was here to change the culture. Daniel's office was a sharp contrast to the tension outside. Minimalist and orderly, it reflected his personality. Focused, efficient, and direct. He gestured for Brad to sit, then closed the door, the soft click of the latch signaling a conversation that would be far more consequential than Brad anticipated. "Officer Halstead," Daniel began, his tone measured but firm, "I'm sure you know why we're here." Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His usual bravado had waned, replaced by a guarded defensiveness. "Look, Chief, if this is about what I said out there." "It is," Daniel interrupted, his voice slicing cleanly through Brad's excuse. "But it's about more than that. It's about what you represent when you put on that uniform. It's about the trust the community places in us, and how easily that trust can be shattered by a single moment of poor judgment." Brad's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He knew better than to argue. Yet his ego wouldn't let him fully accept the rebuke. Daniel leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Do you know why I became a police officer, Brad?" Brad shook his head, unsure how to respond. "I didn't join to wear a badge or carry a gun," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I joined because I believe in what this job can mean, what it should mean. Protection, service, fairness. But over the years, I've seen how easily that ideal can be tarnished by people who forget what they're here to do." Brad swallowed hard, the weight of Daniel's words beginning to sink in. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered, his tone almost contrite. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Didn't mean anything by it. Words have power, Brad. Whether you mean them or not, they reveal who you are. And out there, you showed the world a man who disrespects not only the community he serves, but the uniform he wears." Brad opened his mouth to protest, but Daniel held up a hand. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to hold you accountable. And that starts now. Reckoning and redemption." The next day, Daniel called a meeting with the entire department. The station's conference room was packed, every officer from rookies to seasoned veterans in attendance. The tension was palpable as Daniel stepped to the front, his commanding presence silencing the murmurs that rippled through the crowd. "Let me make one thing clear," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "This department is here to serve everyone in this community. Not some, not most, everyone. And that means we hold ourselves to the highest standard, not just in action, but in word." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I won't tolerate behavior that undermines the integrity of this department or the trust of the people we serve. If you're not here to uphold those values, this isn't the place for you." The room was silent, every officer acutely aware of the pointed message. Brad, seated near the back, felt the weight of every eye that flicked toward him. Daniel wasn't done. "I believe in second chances," he said, his tone softening. "But they aren't given, they're earned. Starting today, this department is committing to change. That includes mandatory cultural sensitivity training, community engagement initiatives, and a renewed focus on accountability." The room buzzed with murmurs again, this time of surprise and curiosity. For some, Daniel's words were a challenge. For others, they were a breath of fresh air, the road to redemption. In the weeks that followed, Brad found himself at a crossroads. Daniel's words lingered, forcing him to confront truths he had long ignored. The cultural sensitivity training sessions were uncomfortable, but they planted seeds of understanding that began to grow despite his resistance. One day, during a community outreach event organized by the department, Brad was assigned to partner with a young officer named Jacobs, the rookie he had dismissed so often before. Their task was simple: visit local businesses, introduce themselves, and listen to community concerns. At first, Brad approached the assignment with reluctance, offering little more than curt nods and rehearsed pleasantries. But as the day wore on, something began to shift. He met a shopkeeper who had been in the neighborhood for decades, a single mother juggling work and parenting, and a teenager passionate about becoming a lawyer to fight injustice. Their stories chipped away at the walls Brad had built around himself, forcing him to see the humanity in people he had so often dismissed. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Brad's journey was messy and fraught with setbacks, but he kept showing up, even when it was hard. And slowly, his actions began to speak louder than his past mistakes. The ripple effect. Months later, Brad stood in the same spot where he had first encountered Daniel. But this time, the scene was different. The street was alive with laughter and conversation as the department hosted a community fair, an initiative spearheaded by Daniel to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. Brad manned a booth alongside Jacobs, handing out safety brochures and answering questions from curious children. When a young boy approached, his eyes wide with curiosity, Brad knelt down to his level. "Are you a real police officer?" the boy asked, his voice filled with awe. Brad smiled, the question tugging at something deep within him. "I am." And you know what? My job is to keep you and your family safe." The boy beamed, his innocence and trust a poignant reminder of what the uniform truly represented. From a distance, Daniel watched the scene unfold. He had seen the changes in Brad, subtle at first, but undeniable. It was a reminder that even the hardest hearts could be softened with time, effort, and a willingness to grow. A legacy of change. As the sun set on the community fair, Daniel stood on the steps of the precinct, reflecting on the journey so far. The work was far from over. Systemic change was a marathon, not a sprint. But moments like these reminded him why he had taken the job. Leadership wasn't about wielding authority. It was about building trust, fostering growth, and creating an environment where everyone, officers and citizens alike, felt valued and heard. And as he watched Brad laugh with a group of children, Daniel allowed himself a small smile. The weight of words was heavy, but so was the power of redemption. It depicts that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable when people chose to rise above their limitations and embrace the humanity in others. Building bridges. Months after that first tense encounter, the department was unrecognizable. The air in the precinct was lighter, yet it carried an undercurrent of determination and purpose. Chief Daniel Carter's vision for transformation had begun to take root, and the seeds of change were sprouting in ways both profound and unexpected. Brad Halstead, once the symbol of the department's old ways, had undergone a quiet but undeniable transformation. His shift wasn't merely a public relations effort or a compliance maneuver. It was the result of introspection, community interaction, and Daniel's relentless belief in the possibility of growth. But true change would require more than just one man's redemption. It needed a unified effort, one that extended far beyond the precinct walls. A new kind of leadership. Daniel stood at the podium in the community center, his voice echoing in the packed hall. The event, titled Building Bridges, a conversation between the community and police, was the first of its kind in the city. Residents, activists, business owners, and officers sat shoulder to shoulder, the room buzzing with curiosity and a cautious optimism. "I know trust has been broken," Daniel began, his tone earnest. "And I know it won't be rebuilt overnight. But we're here tonight because we believe in progress, because we believe that together we can create a department that reflects the values of the community it serves." He paused, scanning the room. Faces reflected a spectrum of emotions: skepticism, hope, frustration, and curiosity. He continued, "This is not just about fixing what's broken. It's about building something better, a partnership grounded in accountability, respect, and understanding." Daniel stepped back, ceding the stage to a panel of speakers that included community leaders, officers, and even a few residents who had been critical of law enforcement in the past. The conversations were raw and unfiltered, touching on systemic inequities, personal experiences, and the shared desire for a safer, more equitable city. Brad's moment. At one point, Brad found himself holding a microphone. He had been invited to share his perspective, a gesture that surprised many in attendance, including himself. Standing in front of the crowd, he felt exposed in a way he never had before. "I'm not proud of the man I was," he began, his voice steady but low. "And I'm not going to stand here and make excuses for my behavior. I've said things, done things that I know now were wrong. Not just wrong, but harmful." He glanced at Daniel, who nodded subtly, offering silent encouragement. "Change is hard," Brad continued, "but it's also necessary. Working with Chief Carter and getting to know this community, really know it, has forced me to see things differently, and I want to do better. I'm committed to doing better." The room was quiet for a beat, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Then, to his surprise, a smattering of applause began, growing into a wave of support. It wasn't forgiveness, at least not entirely, but it was acknowledgement, a recognition of effort, the catalyst for change. The event sparked a movement. Inspired by the dialogue, Daniel proposed a series of initiatives that extended beyond the department's internal reforms. Community ride-alongs. Residents were invited to shadow officers on patrol, fostering mutual understanding and trust. Youth outreach programs. Officers began visiting schools, mentoring students, and hosting workshops on leadership and conflict resolution. Civilian oversight committees. Residents were given a formal voice in evaluating police practices and recommending policy changes. Implicit bias training. The entire department underwent intensive workshops, led by experts, to uncover and address subconscious prejudices. Daniel knew that these initiatives were just the beginning, but they represented a commitment to transparency and collaboration that the community had long demanded. A personal challenge. One evening, Brad found himself walking through a park on the edge of the district. The setting sun bathed the area in a warm golden light, but his thoughts were heavy. He had been invited to speak at a local youth center, a place where many of the teens viewed the police with suspicion, if not outright hostility. As he entered the building, he was greeted by wary eyes and crossed arms. The teens sat in a semicircle, their postures defensive, their expressions skeptical. "From me," he began, his voice quiet. "And I get that. I haven't always been the kind of officer, or the kind of person you'd want to trust." One boy in the front row, no older than 16, crossed his arms and shot back. "So why are you here now?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Brad. He took a deep breath, meeting the boy's gaze. "I'm here because I want to listen. I want to." Brad cleared his throat, his palms damp with nerves. "I know you probably don't want to hear or stand. And I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." The boy didn't reply immediately, but his posture softened ever so slightly. Over the next hour, Brad answered questions, shared his experiences, and, most importantly, listened. By the end of the session, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't a full embrace, but it was a step in the right direction. The ripple effect. Months turned into a year, and the changes Daniel had set in motion began to bear fruit. Crime rates in the district dropped, not because of harsher policing, but because of stronger community relationships. Residents felt safer reporting issues, knowing they would be met with respect and action. Brad became a regular at community events, his presence a testament to the power of transformation. He still had critics, and he knew he always would, but he focused on what he could control: his actions and his commitment to growth. Daniel, meanwhile, continued to lead with integrity and vision. He knew there would always be challenges, systemic issues that wouldn't be solved in a single tenure, but he also knew that change was possible, one step at a time. A legacy of hope. One evening, as Daniel walked through the precinct, he paused to look at the wall where photos of past chiefs were displayed. His own portrait hung at the end of the row, a reminder of how far they had come. Behind him, Brad approached quietly. "Chief," he said, his tone respectful. Daniel turned, offering a small smile. "Brad, I just wanted to say," Brad began, hesitating, "thank you for not giving up on me, for believing I could be better." Daniel's smile widened. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow, Brad. You've earned this." Brad nodded, the sincerity in Daniel's words grounding him. As the two men stood there, the precinct around them buzzing with life, it was clear that this wasn't just a story about redemption. It was a story about the power of leadership, the strength of community, and the enduring belief that even the hardest hearts can be softened with time, effort, and grace. And so, the department continued forward, a beacon of hope and progress, proving that change, while difficult, was always worth pursuing. A future reimagined. The precinct, once a symbol of division and mistrust, had become a hub of innovation and collaboration. Chief Daniel Carter's leadership had transformed it into a living blueprint for what a modern police force could achieve. Yet, as Daniel knew all too well, success was not a destination. It was a continuous journey. It was a cold, rainy morning when Daniel found himself standing at the edge of a new challenge. He had been invited to speak at the Regional Law Enforcement Summit, a gathering of police chiefs, community leaders, and policymakers from across the state. The invitation itself was a testament to the changes his precinct had accomplished, but Daniel didn't see it as a victory lap. For him, it was an opportunity to share a vision for the future, a vision grounded in humanity, equity, and trust. The summit. The cavernous auditorium was packed. Rows of uniforms mingled with civilian attire as attendees filled every seat, their conversations a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Daniel stood backstage, preparing himself for what he knew would be a defining moment in his career. A stagehand approached, gesturing for him to step forward. "You're up, Chief Carter." As Daniel ascended the stage, a ripple of applause spread through the audience. He paused at the podium, letting the noise settle before speaking. His gaze swept the crowd, and for a moment, he saw not a roomful of strangers, but a collection of individuals, each with the power to shape the future. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and clear. "When I became chief, I walked into a department weighed down by mistrust, both from within and from the community we were supposed to serve. It would have been easy to blame the system, to say that the problems were too big for one person to tackle. But I didn't, because I believe in something stronger than the obstacles we face. The power of people to change." He paused, letting the words resonate. Change doesn't happen in the boardroom. It doesn't come from policy alone. It happens in the streets, in the quiet moments, in the choices we make every single day. And it starts with asking ourselves one question: what kind of legacy do we want to leave behind? The room was silent, the weight of his question hanging in the air. "I want to share a story," Daniel continued, "about a man who started as part of the problem, but became part of the solution. The story of Brad." Daniel recounted Brad Halstead's transformation, sparing no detail. He spoke of the initial resistance, the uncomfortable truths, and the moments of vulnerability that paved the way for growth. But more importantly, he spoke of the ripple effect. Brad's journey wasn't just his own, Daniel said. It became a catalyst for others to examine their biases, to confront their fears, and to embrace the possibility of redemption. One man's change inspired an entire department to evolve, and that evolution is still unfolding. As Daniel spoke, Brad sat in the audience, a mix of pride and humility washing over him. He hadn't known that Daniel would use his story as an example, but he understood why. It wasn't about him. It was about what his journey represented, the potential for everyone to rise above their limitations, innovation and vision. After the speech, Daniel joined a panel discussion on innovative policing strategies. The conversation touched on topics ranging from mental health crisis intervention to technology-driven solutions for transparency. Daniel shared his precinct's pilot programs, including community mediation teams, groups of trained officers and civilians who worked together to resolve conflicts before they escalated into violence or arrest, trauma-informed policing, training that equipped officers to approach every situation with empathy and an understanding of the unseen scars people carry, restorative justice circles, a collaboration with local schools and courts to divert first-time offenders into programs that focused on accountability and reconciliation rather than punishment. One audience member, a mayor from a neighboring city, leaned forward. "Chief Carter," she asked, "how do you sustain these programs? Change often falters once the initial momentum fades." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sustainability comes from ownership. A community has to be a partner, not just a recipient. When people see themselves in the process, they fight to keep it alive. And that includes officers. They need to believe in the mission, not just follow orders." A crisis unfolds. As the summit continued, an urgent call came through Daniel's phone. He excused himself and stepped into the hallway to take it. On the other end was Officer Jacobs, his voice tight with worry. "Chief, we got a situation. Protesters have gathered outside the precinct. It started peacefully, but things are escalating. Some officers are on edge." Daniel's chest tightened. He had worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, but he knew how fragile it could be. "I'm on my way," he said, diffusing the tension. By the time Daniel arrived at the precinct, the scene was charged. A crowd of protesters filled the street, their chants a mix of frustration and desperation. Officers formed a line in front of the building, their postures stiff with tension. Daniel didn't hesitate. He walked past the line of officers and into the heart of the crowd. Murmurs rippled through the protesters as they recognized him. He raised his hands, signaling for quiet. "I hear you," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "And I'm here to listen." A woman stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "You say you're different, but things still haven't changed fast enough. We're tired of waiting." Daniel nodded, meeting her gaze. "I understand your frustration. Change takes time, but that doesn't mean we're not committed. Let's talk. Not just here, but in a way that leads to real solutions." The woman hesitated, her anger tempered by his sincerity. Slowly, she nodded. "All right, but we want action, not just words." "You'll have it," Daniel promised. Rebuilding again. In the aftermath of the protest, Daniel met with community leaders to address their concerns. The process was messy and exhausting, but it was also productive. Policies were revisited, timelines accelerated, and new voices brought into the fold. For Daniel, it was a reminder that progress was never a straight line. It was a constant balancing act. Listening, adapting, and persevering. A glimpse of tomorrow. As the precinct continued its transformation, Daniel often reflected on the journey. There were moments of triumph and moments of despair, but through it all, he remained steadfast in his belief. Change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable when people worked together with honesty and determination. One evening, as Daniel walked through the neighborhood, he passed a mural painted on the side of a community center. It depicted people of all backgrounds, standing together under the words, "Unity through justice." He stopped to admire it, a small smile playing on his lips. The mural wasn't just art. It was a testament to the power of hope, a reminder that even the most fractured communities could find common ground. And as he walked away, he knew the work wasn't done. It never would be. But that was the beauty of it. Every day was a chance to build something better. This chapter captures the evolving journey of leadership, emphasizing that true progress is a shared responsibility between communities and institutions. It's a reminder that transformation is a living process. Difficult, imperfect, and endlessly rewarding. A legacy in motion. Chief Daniel Carter stood on the rooftop of the precinct, gazing at the city as twilight set in. The view stretched far beyond the station, encompassing neighborhoods filled with stories, struggles, and potential. The journey so far had been tumultuous, but the city was finally beginning to feel like it was healing. Yet Daniel knew that change was a living thing. It required constant care, courage, and commitment. The precinct had evolved into a model of progressive policing, but with progress came scrutiny. As word of their transformation spread, journalists, activists, and officials descended on the city, eager to dissect, and, in some cases, challenge the changes. Daniel welcomed the attention. It was proof that the world was watching, and he intended to show them what true accountability and partnership looked like. New challenges, new voices. The first hurdle came unexpectedly. A high-profile incident in a neighboring district led to renewed protests citywide. Though the incident didn't involve his department, Daniel knew the ripple effects would reach his precinct. The community's trust in law enforcement was still fragile, and the actions of others threatened to undo the progress they had worked so hard to achieve. At the next staff meeting, Daniel addressed his team. "We can't control what happens outside our jurisdiction," he began, his tone resolute, "but we can control how we respond. This is our chance to lead by example, to show the city and the country that policing can be done differently." The officers, now accustomed to Daniel's approach, nodded in agreement. Many of them had grown to respect his leadership, even those who had initially resisted his vision. But Daniel knew actions spoke louder than words. To prepare, he initiated a series of community resilience workshops, bringing together officers, residents, and experts to discuss how to navigate tense situations with empathy and tact. He also formed a rapid response team, trained specifically in de-escalation tactics and conflict mediation. Brad Halstead, now an advocate for reform within the department, volunteered to lead the team. "I've been on the wrong side of these situations before," he told Daniel. "I want to make sure no one else has to be." Daniel nodded, a flicker of pride crossing his face. "Good. This is your chance to make a difference." The test. The protests began on a crisp autumn evening. Hundreds gathered in the city square, their chants echoing against the towering buildings. The energy was palpable, righteous, passionate, but precarious. One spark could ignite chaos. Brad's rapid response team stood at the edges of the square, observing without imposing. Dressed in approachable, non-militarized uniforms, they mingled with the crowd, listening to concerns and answering questions. Brad himself moved through the throng, his presence calm and steady. At one point, a young protester confronted him. "Why should we trust you?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "People like you are the reason we're out here in the first place." Brad didn't flinch. "You're right," he said simply. "We've made mistakes, big ones, but I'm here to listen, to learn, and to help. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'll do everything I can to earn it." The protester studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "We'll see," she said, turning back to the march. It wasn't a victory, but it was a start. A night to remember. As the night wore on, tensions escalated. A small group of agitators began throwing objects, trying to provoke a reaction from the police. The crowd grew restless, the atmosphere charged with anxiety. Brad's team sprang into action, but instead of rushing in, they used the tactics they'd been trained in. Officers formed small circles around the agitators, calmly speaking to them and de-escalating the situation without resorting to force. Other officers redirected the larger crowd, encouraging them to stay peaceful. Daniel arrived on the scene, his presence reassuring. He moved through the crowd, speaking to protesters and officers alike, his calm demeanor helping to diffuse the tension. Eventually, the agitators were escorted away without incident, and the protest continued peacefully. The next morning, headlines praised the precinct's handling of the event, a model for modern policing. One article declared, "But Daniel knew the real victory wasn't in the press, it was in the trust they had preserved." Mentorship and legacy. As the precinct settled into its new rhythm, Daniel turned his attention to the future. He began mentoring a group of young officers, including Jacobs, the rookie who had been so unsettled by Brad's behavior on that fateful day. Jacobs had grown into a thoughtful, capable officer, and Daniel saw potential in him. During one of their sessions, Daniel asked, "What do you think is the most important part of this job?" Jacobs thought for a moment before replying, "Listening, not just to orders or laws, but to people, to what they need, what they fear, and what they hope for." Daniel smiled. "You're learning faster than I did. Never lose that." He also worked closely with the Civilian Oversight Committee, ensuring that the community's voice remained central to their operations. One of the committee members, an outspoken activist named Sophia, became a key ally. Though they often challenged each other, their mutual respect grew as they worked toward the same goal. The next generation. 1 year later, the precinct held an open house for the community. Families toured the station, meeting officers and learning about their programs. Children laughed as they tried on miniature uniforms, while adults attended workshops on community safety and conflict resolution. Brad, now a trusted leader, stood at a booth discussing the rapid response team's success. Jacobs led a session on youth mentorship, his confidence shining through as he spoke. Daniel moved quietly through the event, taking it all in. He stopped at a table where a group of teens were designing posters for an upcoming community police partnership event. One of them looked up and asked, "Chief Carter, why do you do all this?" Daniel paused, his gaze thoughtful. "Because the world we leave behind is shaped by what we do today. I want to leave something better. For you, for your families, for everyone." The teen nodded, a smile breaking across his face. "I think you already have." The final step. As the sun set on the open house, Daniel stood outside the precinct, watching families trickle home. Brad joined him, his expression reflective. "You've changed this place," Brad said. "We've changed it," Daniel corrected. "This was never about one person. It's about all of us." Brad nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "What's next for you, Chief?" Daniel smiled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "There's always more work to do. But for now, I'm focused on making sure this legacy lasts." As they stood there, the precinct behind them and the city ahead, it was clear that the journey wasn't over. But for the first time, the future felt bright, not just for Daniel or Brad, but for the entire community. This part emphasizes the importance of sustainability, mentorship, and the ongoing nature of progress. It showcases how true leadership creates a ripple effect, inspiring others to carry the torch and ensuring that change becomes a lasting legacy. A city transformed. 2 years after Daniel Carter first took the oath as chief of police, the city stood as a symbol of what could happen when change was more than just a promise. It was a way of life. The precinct's transformation had not only reshaped the department, but had also sparked a citywide renaissance. Communities that had once been fractured by mistrust now found themselves forging partnerships with those sworn to serve and protect them. But even as progress took hold, Daniel knew the journey wasn't over. Every success brought new challenges, and every challenge demanded new solutions. His work wasn't about perfection, it was about resilience. The ripple expands. The precinct's success inspired neighboring departments to reach out, eager to understand how they could replicate the results. Daniel found himself in meetings with police chiefs, mayors, and community leaders from across the region. He shared not just policies and strategies, but the philosophy behind them. "Start with accountability," he would say. "Not just for your officers, but for yourself. Leadership means setting the standard and living by it." One department in a nearby city launched a pilot program modeled after Daniel's restorative justice initiative. Another adopted his trauma-informed policing framework, training officers to approach every situation with empathy and an understanding of the deeper issues at play. Daniel didn't see these as personal victories. They were proof of what was possible when people worked together for the greater good. A new frontier. One morning, Daniel received a call from the governor's office. The governor, a progressive leader with a keen interest in criminal justice reform, invited him to join a statewide task force on policing. The goal: to draft legislation that would create uniform standards for police accountability and community engagement. At first, Daniel hesitated. The precinct demanded his full attention, and he worried about losing focus. But after a long conversation with Sophia, the activist who now co-chaired the Civilian Oversight Committee, he agreed. "This is bigger than us," Sophia had said. "What we've built here is proof that change works. If you can take that to the state level, you'll be helping thousands, maybe millions, of people." The task force meetings were intense. Daniel found himself navigating a maze of political interests, ideological divides, and bureaucratic red tape. But he never lost sight of the mission. He used every tool at his disposal: data from his precinct's programs, stories from the community, and the testimonies of officers like Brad Halstead, to advocate for meaningful reform. When the legislation passed 6 months later, it was hailed as a landmark achievement. Among its provisions were mandatory de-escalation training, statewide standards for transparency, and funding for community police partnership programs. A moment of reflection. Amid the whirlwind of meetings, speeches, and legislative victories, Daniel found solace in small, quiet moments. One evening, he returned to the neighborhood where he had encountered Brad for the first time. The street, once a symbol of tension and discord, now buzzed with life. He passed a mural painted on the side of a community center. It depicted residents and officers standing side by side, their hands clasped in solidarity. At the bottom, in bold letters, were the words, "Justice through unity." Daniel stood there for a long time, the weight of the journey washing over him. It wasn't just about the policies or the headlines. It was about the lives they had touched, the trust they had rebuilt, and the future they had made possible. A crisis and a test. But progress, as Daniel often reminded his team, was never linear. One night, a tragedy struck. A young man, unarmed and fleeing a minor traffic stop, was shot and killed by an officer from another department. The incident reignited old wounds, and protests erupted across the city. Daniel knew the stakes. Trust was fragile, and even though his department wasn't involved, they were still part of the larger system. He called an emergency meeting with his leadership team. "This is our test," he said. "We've built something strong here, but it can all crumble if we don't rise to this moment. We need to show the community that we're with them, that we hear them." The next day, Daniel joined the protests, not as a leader but as a participant. He marched alongside residents, listening to their stories and sharing their grief. Officers from his department followed suit, standing with the community instead of against them. Their presence was met with a mix of skepticism and gratitude. But over time, the skepticism began to fade. The power of partnership. In the wake of the protests, Daniel and Sophia co-hosted a series of town halls, inviting residents, activists, and officials to discuss how to prevent future tragedies. These meetings were raw and emotional, but they were also transformative. One young woman, a college student named Maya, spoke at one of the town halls. "I've hated the police for as long as I can remember," she said, her voice trembling. "But seeing Chief Carter and his officers out there with us, it made me think, maybe not all of them are bad. Maybe some of them really do care." Her words struck a chord. They were a reminder that change wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future where stories like hers could be rewritten. A legacy cemented. As the years went on, Daniel's impact spread far and wide. He became a sought-after speaker, sharing his experiences and insights with audiences around the world. But he never let the accolades distract him from the work that mattered most, serving the people of his city. When the time came for him to step down as chief, the entire city turned out to celebrate his legacy. The mayor presented him with a proclamation, declaring his last day in office as Chief Daniel Carter Day. Brad, now a senior officer and one of the precinct's most respected leaders, delivered a heartfelt speech. "When I met Chief Carter, I was part of the problem. He didn't just hold me accountable. He showed me how to be better. He changed my life, and I'll spend the rest of my career trying to live up to the example he set." A new chapter. After retiring, Daniel didn't slow down. He launched a nonprofit dedicated to fostering community police partnerships, mentoring young leaders, and advocating for justice reform. His work continued to inspire, proving that leadership wasn't about holding a position. It was about making a difference. One evening, as he walked through his neighborhood, he passed a park where children played and families gathered. An older man sitting on a bench called out to him, "Chief Carter." Daniel turned, smiling as he approached. "I'm not the chief anymore." The man chuckled. "You'll always be the chief to us." As they sat and talked, the sounds of laughter and conversation filling the air, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace. The work was far from over, but he had done his part. And that, he knew, was enough. This final chapter captures the culmination of Daniel's journey while emphasizing the ongoing nature of progress. It illustrates how leadership, integrity, and compassion can create a legacy that inspires future generations to continue the work of building a better world. The end of a journey, the beginning of a legacy. As Daniel Carter sat on the bench, Watching the life of the city he had dedicated himself to serve, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had given his all. The laughter of children echoed through the park, mingling with the hum of everyday life, a harmony that once felt unattainable. In his decades of service, Daniel had come to understand a fundamental truth. Leadership isn't about power or authority. It's about service. It's about having the courage to face hard truths, the humility to listen, and the resolve to act, not for oneself, but for the greater good. The lesson of redemption. Brad Halstead's transformation stood as a testament to the power of accountability and compassion. He had gone from a symbol of the system's failings to a champion of its potential. His story was a reminder that no one is beyond redemption, and that change, however difficult, is possible when people are given the tools and the opportunity to grow. But Brad's story was more than a personal redemption arc. It was a ripple that spread through the precinct and into the community. It showed that when leaders believe in their people, hold them accountable, and give them room to improve, they can become the change they seek. The lesson of unity. The community, once fractured by mistrust, had come to see the precinct not as an adversary, but as a partner. This shift didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't the result of grand speeches or sweeping gestures. It was built one interaction at a time. In the conversations held during protests, the partnerships formed in town halls, and the trust rebuilt on the streets. The mural on the community center, Justice Through Unity, wasn't just an artwork. It was a reflection of what the city had become, a place where differences were acknowledged, but no longer used to divide. A place where people stood together, even in the face of adversity. The lesson of leadership. As Daniel transitioned into his next chapter, he knew the work wasn't finished. Progress wasn't a destination. It was a journey that required constant vigilance and effort. He had laid the groundwork, but it was up to others. People like Brad, Jacobs, Sophia, and the countless others he had mentored, to carry the torch forward. Leadership, Daniel realized, wasn't about being irreplaceable. It was about building a system that could thrive without you, about empowering others to lead in their own right. The final reflection. On his last evening in the city, Daniel visited the precinct one final time. He walked through the halls, now buzzing with the energy of a team committed to their mission. He paused at the wall of past chiefs, his own portrait now hanging among those who came before him. For a moment, he let himself reflect, not on the accolades or the challenges, but on the people. The officers who had risen to the occasion, the community members who had trusted him, the families who had been touched by their work. They were his legacy. As he stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him. He took one last look at the precinct, then turned toward the city. He didn't see the flaws or the struggles that remained. He saw the potential, and he knew he was leaving it in good hands. The parting words. To those who ask how he managed to create such change, Daniel would always say the same thing. Progress begins with listening. It grows through accountability, and it lasts because of trust. If you can lead with those principles, you can transform anything, an organization, a community, or even a life. And so, as Daniel Carter stepped into the next chapter of his journey, his story left behind a simple but powerful lesson. Change is possible when we lead with courage, act with integrity, and never stop believing in the power of people to be better together. This conclusion ties together the story's major themes: leadership, accountability, redemption, and unity, leaving readers with a sense of hope and a clear, actionable lesson. The path to progress lies in listening, trust, and the willingness to change. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.